Let me walk you through something that fundamentally distorts how most people understand military conflict. The common assumption is simple. The nation with the largest army, the biggest budget, and the most advanced technology will inevitably prevail. On paper, that logic seems airtight. But reality has a way of complicating clean theories. The United States operates the most formidable military machine humanity has ever constructed. That's not hyperbole. The Pentagon's annual budget exceeds what the next 10 countries spend combined. American weaponry sits generations ahead of most competitors. The global footprint of bases, the satellite networks providing real-time intelligence, the nuclear triad, the carrier strike groups roaming every ocean, it genuinely has no historical precedent. In a traditional head-to-head conventional war against virtually any other nation, the outcome wouldn't be in doubt. It would end decisively and quickly. And yet, here we are, decades into sustained American pressure against Iran, and Tehran remains firmly in place. Sanctions have crippled the economy. Top commanders have been assassinated. Proxy conflicts have bled Iranian resources. The regime hasn't collapsed. The military continues developing new capabilities. The government still refuses to bend to Washington's will. How does a country with a microscopic fraction of the American defense budget, aging equipment, and no nuclear umbrella survive a permanent standoff with the most powerful military in history? The answer lies in a fundamental mismatch of definitions. Iran isn't trying to win the way America conceptualizes winning. They're playing an entirely different game. Once you grasp that distinction, their entire strategic posture clicks into focus. Here's a useful analogy. Picture two combatants. One is a champion heavyweight boxer. Powerful, explosive, technically refined through years of training. The other is smaller, lighter, outmatched in any direct physical confrontation. Inside a boxing ring, following boxing rules, the smaller fighter loses every time. No contest. Now move that fight into a dark alleyway, then into a crowded marketplace, then into an apartment building the smaller fighter has inhabited for 2 decades and knows intimately. Suddenly, the environment reshapes everything. The boxer's advantages become constraints. The smaller fighter's familiarity becomes a weapon. This is the essence of asymmetrical warfare. It's not a modern invention. Weaker actors have employed it against empires since antiquity. The principle is straightforward. Refuse to engage on the stronger power's preferred terrain. Redefine the battlefield until their strengths turn into vulnerabilities. This isn't abstract theory. In 2002, the Pentagon conducted Millennium Challenge, one of the largest military simulations ever staged. The scenario pitted American forces against a Middle Eastern adversary modeled closely on Iran's capabilities and tactics. 2 teams, blue representing the United States, red representing the adversary. What happened next blindsided the entire defense establishment. The red team commander, instead of confronting the American naval armada directly, unleashed swarming tactics. Small, fast boats, unconventional missile launches, communication methods designed to evade American surveillance and jamming, surprise, speed, chaos. Within hours, the simulation showed a significant portion of the Blue Fleet destroyed. Thousands of simulated casualties, billions in simulated losses. The world's most powerful navy had been defeated by an opponent who simply refused to fight the way the rules anticipated. Here's where it gets even more revealing. The exercise was halted and restarted. This time, the Red commander was instructed to abandon those asymmetrical tactics and fight in a conventional, predictable manner. When the simulation resumed under those conditions, America won handily. What does that tell us? American military dominance is absolutely real and overwhelming, but only when the conflict stays within American-defined parameters. The moment an adversary declines those terms, the entire equation transforms. Iran has absorbed these lessons meticulously. They've studied Vietnam, where American technological and firepower superiority proved unable to translate into decisive victory because the other side refused to fight the expected war. They've studied Afghanistan, where 2 decades of the most sophisticated military campaign in history failed against fighters armed with basic weapons and intimate knowledge of their own terrain. They've studied every instance where imperial power met the hard limits of raw force. From that study, Iran has constructed what strategists might call a layered strategic framework. Every action, every alliance, every weapons program, Every diplomatic overture must serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Because when you're a smaller power facing a superpower, efficiency isn't optional. You cannot afford gestures. You cannot expend political capital on moves that accomplish only one thing. Everything must work on at least 2 or 3 levels at once. So what are those levels? What is Iran actually trying to achieve with this matrix? First, internal cohesion. If conflict erupts, if bombs fall or American ships press into the Gulf aggressively, Iran needs its population to consolidate behind the regime, not fracture. This matters enormously. One of the primary ways external powers break resistant governments is by turning populations against their leaders during crises. If Iranians perceive themselves under attack, survival instinct takes over. National identity overrides political grievances. The government becomes exponentially harder to destabilize from within. So every Iranian action carries an implicit message. This is a fight for collective survival, not a dispute between competing domestic factions. Second, alliance multiplication. Iran cannot stand alone. No nation can. Over decades, Tehran has methodically cultivated relationships across the region and beyond. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militia networks throughout Iraq and Syria, strategic partnerships with Russia and China at the diplomatic level. None of these are random. Each represents a node in a distributed network designed to complicate American decision-making. If striking Iran means triggering simultaneous responses across multiple countries, the cost of that strike escalates dramatically. Washington suddenly faces not a single conflict, but a region in flames. Third, global opinion warfare. This is one the United States consistently underestimates and Iran takes deadly seriously. Modern wars aren't decided solely on battlefields. They're fought at the United Nations, in international media, in the streets of global cities where populations protest or cheer. If Iran can consistently frame any conflict as a smaller nation defending itself against imperial aggression, the political price for Washington rises. Congressional support becomes fragile. Allied governments grow reluctant to participate. The moral narrative matters. Fourth, strategic attrition. Not destroying America, not humiliating America in some spectacular confrontation, exhausting America, gradually increasing the cost of engagement until the calculation in Washington shifts from "can we win this" to "is this worth it?" Economic disruption through pressure on oil shipping routes, psychological pressure through missile threats to American regional bases, constant low-level friction that drains resources, attention, and political will over time. Now here's the crucial insight underpinning everything. This entire strategy depends on one quality above all others: patience. America operates on a fundamentally different clock. Presidential elections every 4 years. Public opinion shifting with news cycles. Budgets debated annually. Media demanding constant developments. The entire political system incentivizes quick results. Voters don't want to hear that a conflict might stretch a decade. Iran thinks in generational terms. This approach has been developing since 1979. They're not seeking a rapid victory. They're cultivating conditions where America eventually concludes that the cost of sustained pressure exceeds any possible benefit, where Washington decides the resources consumed by maximum pressure campaigns could be better deployed elsewhere, where American political will simply runs out. History suggests this is precisely how many asymmetrical conflicts end, not with the weaker side achieving some decisive battlefield triumph, with the stronger side exhausting itself and withdrawing. There's another dimension that makes Iranian strategy particularly unsettling for American planners: the economics of modern weapon systems. American aircraft carriers cost roughly $5 billion each to build. The aircraft operating from them cost hundreds of millions per unit. The defensive systems protecting those carriers require enormous investment. Iran has spent years developing relatively inexpensive drones, missiles, and small boat swarms capable of threatening those assets. Not reliably, not with certainty, but sufficiently to force America to allocate massive resources protecting enormously expensive hardware from relatively cheap threats. When the cost of defense consistently exceeds the cost of offense, The mathematics of warfare shift. The stronger power begins hemorrhaging money in ways that become politically unsustainable over extended periods. This is the endgame Iran is pursuing, not a dramatic military victory, a strategic environment where confronting Iran consistently costs more than it yields, where Washington eventually concludes that some form of accommodation beats permanent draining conflict. The most critical thing to understand about all this is timing. The strategy doesn't activate when shooting starts. It operates for years beforehand. Every alliance cultivated, every missile developed, every diplomatic relationship nurtured, every narrative shaped for international consumption. All of it is preparation. By the time any actual conflict becomes visible to the public, the strategic terrain has already been sculpted over decades. That's why analysts who limit themselves to counting tanks and aircraft carriers miss the point entirely. Conventional military power matters enormously, but it doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates inside an environment deliberately constructed over very long time horizons. And in that environment, survival equals victory. Endurance is winning. If Iran remains standing, functioning, projecting influence across the region 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, that's the win. It was always the win. The question was never whether Iran could defeat America. The question was always whether Iran could outlast America. So far, against every form of pressure applied, the answer has been yes. That's what makes this strategy simultaneously fascinating and genuinely terrifying to the officials in Washington, whose job is to think about these things for a living.